All right, guys, welcome to the second 9 weeks of world history. So as you can see, our second 9 weeks is going to look a little bit different than our first 9 weeks. So make sure you're taking the Middle Ages pre-test first. Remember, it's a pre-test. You're not supposed to know anything. And so I'm not going to put our Edgenuity grades in Canvas like I did last 9 weeks, because it was clogging up all of our grades. So what I'm going to do is on Focus, I'm going to take your Edgenuity overall actual grade and put that in there every week. So it's going to gradually go up and your grade's going to gradually get better. So your Edgenuity expectations for the Middle Ages units for quarter 1, you're going to, for this first module, Medieval Kingdoms in Europe, you're going to finish the early Middle Ages, feudalism, and life in the early Middle Ages, and you should be finished with these modules by Friday, November 6th. And so you can see we're going to go over this PowerPoint right here, and then you have 6 assignments to complete by Friday. So let's look at this PowerPoint. Let's see if it downloads. All right. So talking about medieval kingdoms in Europe. A little bit of background: at the end of the Roman Empire, the gradual decline of the Roman Empire ushered in the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period between 500 to 1500 AD or CE, which is Common Era. And so here's what Europe looked like at that time. So you have North Africa with Carthage, Egypt is over here, Crete, which belongs to Greece, Rome, Italy, Turkey, Syria, Cyprus, the Black Sea's right here, England still here, Germany is in the middle, France. Germanic groups overran the Western Roman Empire, and with repeated invasions and constant warfare, sparked new trends, including government, economy, and cultures. Invasions from land and sea collapsed business, breaking down trade and economies. After the fall of Rome, cities were abandoned as centers of administration. Roman centers of trade and government collapsed. Nobles retreated to rural areas, and cities were left without strong leadership. Few people, except for church officials, were literate, meaning they could read and write. Knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome were completely lost. Germanic peoples overtook former Roman provinces. The province of Gaul was taken by the Franks, who were led by Clovis, and that's the French area, that's France. He converted to Christianity, and the church supported him in his exploits against other Germanic tribes. German-speaking people mixed with the Roman population, and Latin began to change. Different dialects, such as French and Spanish, developed. The various languages contributed to the further breakup of the empire. Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman provinces. The church survived the fall of Rome, and it provided order and security. And when we say the church, we mean the Catholic Church. The Frankish king Pepin the Short kept the Lombards from invading Rome. The Pope named Pepin king by the grace of God, establishing the Carolingian dynasty. I'm never going to get that right. Pepin died in 768, and he left his kingdom to his sons Charlemagne and Carloman. Charlemagne took control of the entire kingdom after his brother died, and Charlemagne built this vast empire. Throughout his conquest, he spread Christianity, and he united Europe for the first time since Roman power. Charlemagne's heirs were weak, and they eventually divided the empire. So now we're on to lesson 1, feudalism. Viking invaders sacked villages and towns. They were warriors, traders, and explorers. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus. Viking ships were long, narrow, and could hold up to 300 men, and they could sail in a few feet of water. The bow of the ship was usually a monster. So this is supposed to be a dragon, It's kind of a sad looking dragon. Those are better looking dragons. The area of France known as Normandy was given to the Vikings in an attempt to establish a policy of settling and converting them to Christianity. So that's the very northern part. And you're going to hear about Normandy again when we talk about World War II. So here's England. So it's just across the English Channel. They organized governments. Organized governments began to be torn apart. People began to look at local leaders for protection. As a result, feudalism formed. The system created is known as feudalism, based on mutual obligations in exchange for military protection. The landlord granted land to a fief, and the person receiving the fief is known as a vassal. Vassals who held fiefs also had political authority. The vassal of a king might also have vassals himself. So here's the pyramid of power. So at the very bottom, we have peasants. These are the working people, the widows, the milk girls, the barmaids, the farmers. And then you have the knights. These are vassals. Then you, under or above the vassals and the knights, you have nobles. And then above them, you have the king. So the peasants provide food and services to the knights, who in turn provide military protection and military service to the nobles, and the nobles give money and knights to the king. The king gives land to the nobles, and the nobles then give the land to the knights and the vassals, and then the vassals in turn give land and protection to the peasants. Peasants were at the bottom of feudal society, and they worked in the fields. Social classes were usually inherited. Most people were peasants or serfs. Serfs could not lawfully leave the place where they were born. So there was no bettering yourself. Knights were mounted warriors who pledged to defend. That means they rode horses. They became the backbone of European aristocracy. The system of feudalism is also known as the feudal contract. Nobles were kings, dukes, counts, barons, and bishops. These were the aristocracy. They owned large estates and held political, social, and economic power. Tournaments were held where knights would compete with each other to demonstrate their fighting skills. Jousting is when two knights charged at each other with lances. Chivalry was a code of ethics that knights were required to follow. Under this code, knights were required to defend the church, their lord, and defenseless people, especially their lady. Women could legally own property, but most remained under the control of their fathers or their husbands. Women were expected to be subservient to men and considered inferior. There were a few strong women, including Eleanor of Aquitaine. She married the King of France and then later married the King of England. Two of her sons, Richard, aka the Lion-Hearted, and John, both became kings of England. Now we're on to peasants' trade in cities. The population of Europe doubled from 1,000 to 1,300. Those years, from 38 million to 74 million people. That's a lot of people. The climate shifted in the 1000s and farming technology improved, causing an increase in food production. They shifted from a two-field system to a three-field crop rotation. Fallow land was left to recoup fertility and did not have anything planted on it. So basically they would take 3 fields of crops, and they would not plant one year, but they'd plant the other 2, and then they'd rotate. So the next year, the one that they didn't plant the year before, they would plant that one, and then another one would be left. In the 3-field system, 1 field was planted with the summer crop. The other field was planted with the winter crop, and the 3rd field was left fallow, meaning they didn't plant anything on it. Landed estates were on fiefs and worked by peasants. They became known as manors. Manors usually consisted of a few square miles, a manor house, church, and workshop. So it was like a mini city. They were self-sufficient communities producing everything they needed: fuel, leather, crops, and lumber. In the Middle Ages, the manor was the basic economic system. The lord provided housing, land, and protection of serfs. Now, when we say lord in this instant, we're not talking about God. We're talking about the lord of the manor. So he was like the owner of the whole thing. The serfs tended the lord's land, cared for animals, and performed other tasks to maintain the estates. And so this picture kind of gives you an idea of what the manor area would look like. Peasants paid a high price. Work was labor intensive. They had to have the permission of the lord to marry. They paid a tithe or a church tax to the priest. They warmed their homes by bringing the pigs inside, and their staple food was a thick, dense bread. And so here you can see the inside of their homes, typical inside. So you had livestock quarters inside the house. You got water. There's a little kitchen area, and there's the bed and the fire to cook on. Not exactly the best living conditions. Medieval Europe was mostly agricultural, and most people lived in small villages. Merchants and artisans became the bourgeoisie, or a middle class. Trade fairs sprung up across Europe where honey, cloth, tin, furs, sugar, silk, and spices were traded. The most commonly traded item was cloth. Increased trade created a greater need for large amounts of cash. The church forbid lending money for interest. People borrowed money from Jews who lived on the outskirts of town called ghettos. Medieval cities were surrounded by stone walls. City streets were dirty and were often covered in human and animal waste. As trade increased, cities became important centers for manufacturing and trade. Craftspeople organized themselves into guilds, which is kind of like a club. They set standards of quality, prices, and determined who could enter the trade. William of Normandy landed in England in 1066. So we're talking about the growth of European kingdoms now. After being victorious at the Battle of Hastings, he became the King of England. Nobles began to resent the growing power of the king. So in 1215, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, aka the Great Charter. The Magna Carta guaranteed English nobles basic rights, such as no taxation without representation, a trial by jury, and protection of the law. In 843, the Carolingian Empire was divided into 3 sections. The western section became known as the Kingdom of France. After the last Carolingian king died, a Frankish noble named Capetian was elected to be King of France. The new dynasty had little power. Their power grew after the reign of Philip II. He sought to regain control of French land that was taken by the English. By 1300, France was the largest and best governed monarch in Europe. A parliament was also created in France called the Estates General. The Eastern Frankish kingdoms became Germany and was ruled by Saxon kings. The most famous was Otto I. Otto I took control of the church and was crowned Emperor of the Romans. Under Frederick I, it became known as the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope opposed Italy being part of the Holy Roman Empire. Papal and northern Italian forces defeated Frederick in 1176. While Germanic kings attempted to take over Italy, they left Germany under the control of local lords. These lords broke away and established their own kingdom. So Germany was no longer a whole thing. It was now separated into all these different little lordship kingdoms. Neither Germany nor Italy created a national monarchy in the Middle Ages. Instead, they both consisted of small, independent states. So Italy was the same way, with little individual kingdoms. And so here's the Pope. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, or after the Umayyad Caliphate took control of Spain in 725, most people in the region had converted to Islam to avoid attacks. The Reconquista was the Christian reconquest of Spain. So the Christians came back in with the intent to take over Spain. By 929, Spain was divided with Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim emirates in the south. The Reconquista continued for another 500 years. The Mongols invaded Eastern Europe in the 13th century. Their brutal attacks caused people to flee their advances. So these are the Mongols. Positive effects of the Mongol invasion include the introduction of inventions like gunpowder and the increase in trade. So that concludes the lesson part. So make sure that you go back and look at and complete feudalism, peasants, trade in cities, and the growth of European kingdoms. Lesson 3, reading essentials, reading essentials and the quizzes, and make sure you complete the Edgenuity expectations. And then the next video is going to be all about crusades and culture in the Middle Ages.